Within the Christian faith, of course, this is one of the most important commandments that people of faith are supposed to abide by, to offer hospitality to the stranger, right? It's repeated multiple times.
You're listening to Good Faith Weekly. I'm Mitch Randall.
And I'm Missy Randall.
We're here each week exploring the intersection of faith and culture.
We find people who stand up, speak out, and step forward
for inclusion, freedom, and justice for all.
It's time for Good Faith Weekly.
Brought to you by Good Faith Media. Welcome to Good Faith Weekly. On this episode, Missy and I are going to catch up. We're going to talk about how each of us are coping after last week's election. And then later on the pod, we sat down with professors Lloyd Barba and Sergio González. They've got a new podcast out titled Sanctuary: On the Border Between Church and State. It is absolutely fascinating and very poignant at this time, at this moment. It's a great pod, so stay tuned. Hello there, Missy.
Hey, how are you?
I am well, and you?
I'm having some feelings.
Is that an extension of the feelings you had last week?
Probably. I'm trying to cope. I'm trying to be here.
You are doing a fantastic job.
No, you were such a liar.
I was trying to be supportive.
I'm not well. Yes. So more on that later, on a deeper level.
On a deeper level, yes.
Because I can't, because we tried to talk before we came online.
Right.
And I can't.
You can't. I get it. Totally get it. I think you are in a place where a lot of people are right now.
I think I am.
Yeah.
I just want to hide under the covers. Yeah. Anyways, hold on.
But there is something that you can do.
I mean, I had a response.
You did
guys.
have a response. Because everything feels so out of control, you actually took some control back. So tell everybody what you did.
Right, which I didn't super appreciate your psychoanalysis of my behavior this week.
Hey, that's my $5,000 psychology degree I got 30 years ago.
That's right, but you're not wrong. So let's fill the audience in. So I had a response. And right now, if you are a man, I'm sorry, you're not going to understand this. Chances are, if you're a woman, you might understand this. But I did a thing this week.
Tell the audience what you did.
I got bangs.
Wow. You're such a rebel.
Right? It just felt like the right thing to do. And so I'm guessing many women out in the audience who are listening understand because, and I have to say also our oldest son understood when we talked to him and I said, I think I'm going to get bangs. He said, oh, Mom, it must be bad. And I was so proud that my son knew what that meant. So anyways, so that is the only response I think I can talk about without completely falling apart right now.
Yeah.
I got bangs.
And for what it's worth, they look fabulous.
I know you really are enjoying this new look, aren't you?
Yes. Yeah. So, no, it looks great. Maybe, will you post a picture of them?
Yes, I will. And in the meantime, should we talk about like your response this past weekend?
Yes, we can talk about my response. So, I actually took my beard clipper from a 2 to a 1.5.
Whatever. No, not that.
Oh, not that. Okay.
Not that. So we spent our first weekend,
yes,
which was actually at home, in our little old Renault house that we've been working on, or not we have been working on, we've been writing big checks for people to work on.
Yeah.
Now we're in the stage of the DIY projects,
yes,
right?
The things that we can do.
Which we thought we can do this, right?
Yes.
Spoiler alert.
We can't.
We can't. We're terrible DIYers. However, this weekend, there's this one cabinet door because we lived in an old house. And there are lots of fun, like character enhancing built-ins. But there was this cabinet door for the hallway that needed painted, right? But it had this shiny lacquer on it. So it needed to be sanded a little bit. So I took it outside and I kind of scraped the paint off of it, and then it needed to be sanded. And you were like, you know what? I'll get my sander out. I'll do that for you.
I'll take care of that.
Right?
Yeah.
And I was like, that's so nice of you. So my words were...
I made a mistake. My
words were, it just needs a light sanding so the paint will have something to adhere to, right?
Yeah.
Oops, sorry, party foul. My phone just went off.
Yeah, come on.
My apologies. Anywho, so I left to go run errands, and I came back, and you had sanded this cabinet door so hard that it now showed like peaks and valleys in the wood grain.
Yeah.
Like,
I mean, if I'm not mistaken, you could actually tell I went so deep into the wood grain that you could actually tell how old the tree was when it was cut down.
True. So essentially, you basically ruined this cabinet door.
I had some frustration that I had to get out.
That was very evident. So this cabinet door is now... I don't know how to explain it. It's just like a texture of the wood grain, and then like a little bit down is the wood. Anyways, so
I went through decades of paint getting to that wood.
And also just growth in general. So now we're just faced with, what do we do? What do we do? So you were like, looked on YouTube, and some guy said, you just put mud over it to make it even, right?
Just put some mud on it.
So this stupid cabinet door... we have spent countless hours on to try to rehab it, to get it just flat to where I could paint it.
Yep.
I will say, at the end of the day, on Sunday night, when you rehung this cabinet door, it's adequate. That's what I will say.
Hey, at this day, at this moment, I will take adequate.
Right.
But one of the funny things that happened while I was out there taking my aggression out on this door was that I heard Kat.
You did?
Kat came and visited me while I was working hard.
Kat.
Yeah. And I heard Kat's meow. And you know how Kat gets. I mean, he's just so loud. But I couldn't find Kat anywhere. I mean, I didn't know where he was. I looked,
it's just the Holy Spirit, Mitch.
I thought it was the Holy Spirit. But then I looked up to the heavens. And there was Kat staring at me on our roof.
On our roof. He was looking down at you. I mean, literally, figuratively, and
in all
spiritually.
The ways.
All the ways.
That's right.
Kat. If you need a refresher on Kat, you've got to go back a few months and listen to all the episodes, because he is a recurring character.
Yeah, so both you and I, reacted in different ways, but similar ways.
We've had our responses, right?
Have, yeah.
Right? So yes, now I have bangs, and also we have a really funky looking cabinet door with some really vintage texture to it. We'll call it that.
Absolutely. So, well, moving on, the world continues to go around, and this week was Veterans Day.
Yes.
Yeah. So to all of our veterans out there, we want to wish you a very happy Veterans Day, and thank you for your service throughout the years. But on Veterans Day, you and I started kind of talking about veterans, and I was reminded of a couple of veterans that kind of unique stories in my life.
Yeah, you have some great stories of veterans in your life who are Native that I think would be fun to share.
Yeah.
With class.
With the class, yeah. So the first one I want to share is the Comanche chief who gave my brother and myself our indigenous names. And
tell us what your indigenous name is.
My indigenous name is Numukutsu, which is sacred buffalo. And my brother is Hanaba'akwata, which is running creek. And so when we went to this chief's house, Chief Charles Chibity, he started telling stories before he actually gave us our names. Well, not only was this an incredible moment for us, as well as just being in the presence of this incredible chief and holy person, he was also, Missy, a World War II code talker.
Yeah, that's so amazing.
It is so amazing to be able to meet him and to get to know him, not only that day, but a couple of times afterwards. But he started telling stories that day, and he started laughing by the fire, and he started recalling about how the Comanches, also there's Navajo and other tribes that were code talkers throughout World War II. For those who are unfamiliar with the code talkers, the U.S. Army enlisted Native-speaking soldiers to basically give information, share information among infantry, among divisions, talking in their native tongue because nobody knew those languages.
Nobody could crack that code.
Nobody could crack that code. Right. So one of them was the Comanches. And so Chief Chibity was telling the story. He started to laugh. He said, yeah, he said, I could always imagine if there was some, wayward Comanche out there listening over the airwaves thinking, what is that crazy Indian doing? Those are his words. And I said, well, why is that? He said, because when we would talk, there are no Comanche words for bomber or tank. So they had to make things up. And so the term for bomber was geese, and the term for tank was turtles. So he said, we started talking about these thousands of geese and thousands of turtles, across the land. He said, we would laugh at ourselves thinking about what we were literally saying in the midst of war. But that was a really cool story.
But you just don't think about that.
No,
A native person would not have a word. Would they have a word for internet?
I doubt it.
Or email? What would they call that?
It's called magic.
Right, sorcery.
The white man's magic.
Sorcery, that's what it's called. Okay.
And here's the second one. And this is a little closer to home because I'm related to this person. And that is Second Lieutenant Ernest Childers. Ernest was a resident at Schlaco Agricultural School where my great-grandmother and her sister resided.
Which you've talked about many times.
Yeah, I've talked about many times.
The Indian boarding schools.
So he was a student there in the 30s and joined the ROTC. They had an ROTC program there at the boarding school. And so he joined it with some others. Well, eventually he ends up in the war in the European campaign in World War II. And he was in Italy. And Second Lieutenant Childers did some incredible, made some incredible sacrifices as well as bravery, fought off machine gunners, killed 2 of the enemy who were attacking his squad, and just really saved a lot of lives in a really heated instance in Italy. Well, because of his bravery and his leadership during that time, he was awarded the Medal of Honor, which is the highest honor a soldier can get. And so, yeah, it was really, really a neat honor for him to be given. In fact, he was the first Indigenous person to receive the Medal of Honor since the Indian Wars of the 1800s.
Isn't there a statue of him in Oklahoma City?
There's several statues of him here in Oklahoma. One, he was part of the 145th Infantry Division here out of Oklahoma City. There's a statue of him there. There's also one in Broken Arrow, where I grew up. My dad grew up, that commemorates his sacrifice and his service for his country. So those are 2 veterans I'm really proud of. Chief Charles Chibity as well as Ernest Childers.
I love that. I love that the Indigenous people are so giving to our country. I mean, we could have a whole nother conversation about that. We could have a whole
conversation about that. That's exactly right. So to Ernest and Ernest and Charles' memory, we want to wish all of our veterans a happy Veterans Day and week.
And thank you for your sacrifice.
Absolutely. Thank you for
your service.
Absolutely. So Missy, you and I get to sit down with 2 very interesting scholars this week. It was kind of fortuitous to actually have them on the show this week. They are Professor Lloyd Barba and Professor Sergio González. And they have a brand new podcast out titled Sanctuary. And they talk about the history of the sanctuary movement that ministers and provides safety to immigrants and refugees here in this country, but also around the world historically. So it's a very fascinating conversation that we have with them. I hope that the listeners enjoy it. But we'll be right back with Lloyd and Sergio.
So much of what I learned in church was about doing instead of being. Pray this prayer, affirm this belief, save your soul. But doesn't our faith teach us that there's nothing we can do to earn or escape God's love? I'm Brett Harris, host of God Knows Where, and if we can't do anything, then I think we need to better understand who we're supposed to be. Join me for Wayfinding, a new series exploring Jesus' parables to discover who God calls us to be. Find God Knows Where on your favorite podcast platform.
Welcome back to Good Faith Weekly. On this episode, we've got two very special guests with us. Dr. Lloyd Barba is Assistant Professor of Religion and Core Faculty in Latinx and Latin American Studies at Amherst College. And Sergio González is an Assistant Professor of History at Marquette University. They are the co-host of the limited edition podcast series Sanctuary, on the border between church and state. Lloyd and Sergio, welcome to Good Faith Weekly.
Thanks for having us.
Excited to be here. Thank you.
So Lloyd, we'll start with you. I'm going to just ask about the podcast in general. Tell us about the concept, kind of how it came to be and why you guys decided to do this project.
So the podcast, the recording itself, sort of the process of the podcast, that's a pretty recent thing. But the reality is that Sergio and I have been researching the sanctuary movement for years at this point. So I believe Sergio has about 10 years of study in this, and I started to study the sanctuary movement a bit more in earnest as we were in a moment in 2016 that we find ourselves in today with Trump's election. And so to take you back to fall 2016, I had taught about sanctuary movement a little bit. I didn't think it was going to be a topic that I was going to research. Then there's sanctuary cities, sanctuary campuses, sanctuary houses of worship that just rolled out all throughout the country.
Right.
So we've been at this for a while, and having gone through the first Trump term, Sergio and I, there's a confluence, if you will, right? He's working on his own thing, I'm working on my own thing. Then we were both on a project on Latino faith politics since 1945. And we just had a really good sort of synergy at that point and decided to take up some projects together. So we've been working on a edited volume. So we got other authors, historians to contribute to a book. And we were working on that for about 2 years at this point. It's under contract with Newark University Press. Then Brad approached me about the possibility of a podcast, and I let him know that I'm now working on Sanctuary, and I told him about the project I'm working on with Sergio. And so we put our heads together, and there's always this sense that we didn't want the topic of Sanctuary to be relevant come November 2024, but that's the case we find ourselves in today. Sure. And so we produced it in mind with, people of faith, academics, just anyone trying to understand what is sanctuary. And so we did the historical sweep from the 80s to the present day, and it is unfortunately more relevant than we anticipated.
It's funny you mentioned, starting in 2016, and my first thought was, wow, so much has changed, and yet so much stays the same.
Yeah, I'm still kind of in this state of denial, because when he mentioned the first Trump administration, I started to kind of get twitchy because it kind of dawned on me, oh, there's a second coming. But thanks for kind of telling us about how all of this began, because I think it is very important. So Sergio, first of all, I think a lot of people have heard the language and the phraseology of sanctuary cities. But if you could just briefly tell us, what is the classical definition of sanctuary and where it comes from? Because this is one of the great things about the podcast, especially that first episode. You guys lay out the history behind it.
Yeah, I appreciate that, Mitch. I mean, I think you're exactly right. This is the starting point for us. Is that this is term that is, in fact, overused and oftentimes very misapplied, right? In the way in which it's used as a political term, and often as well as a religious term. And so what Lloyd and I were trying to do in this podcast was to give some definition to it. But as historians, of course, we wanted to go back to the origins. And so to think about sanctuary as a practice, right? This is something that is deeply embedded in many faiths, right? You think about this idea of hospitality and the way in which communities welcome people, and specifically religious communities welcome people. And within the Christian faith, of course, this is one of the most important commandments that people of faith are supposed to abide by, to offer hospitality to the stranger, right? It's repeated multiple times in the Old and New Testament. Immigration and migration refugee activists beginning in the 1980s really began to use this scriptural idea as a form of justifying their actions as they tried to offer safe harbor to people who are arriving at the U.S.-Mexico border, try to avail themselves of the American political asylum process. They're coming from Central America, fleeing revolution and war, and yet they found themselves often completely denied access to this type of political refuge. And the reason, of course, was that the United States was involved in military conflicts in the region and didn't want to recognize these people as refugees. So houses of worship at the U.S.-Mexico border took it upon themselves to enact, right, to really embody this idea of of hospitality, of radical hospitality, of sanctuary by opening their church doors to these people, knowing that they might be breaking the law by doing so. And so what Lloyd and I try to do is to demonstrate that history that goes back in the 1980s, that has actual callbacks to scripture, has also callbacks to what Lloyd has referred to as usable histories in the past in American history, whether that's the Underground Railroad or Vietnam anti-war protesters who took refuge in churches in the 1970s. And the way in which that became really the basis for an entire model for both religious activism and immigration activism. And of course, as we mentioned, it became very relevant in 2016. And I think it's going to continue to have a lot of relevance moving forward as we think about what awaits us in 2025.
Yeah. And so that was what, as I was listening to that first episode and then the episodes following, one thing that continued to come to my mind was the fact that for those of us who call ourselves Christians and Jesus followers, just that stark reminder that our faith is actually rooted in a person who was a migrant and who was a refugee at an early age. And you think about those first few chapters where Jesus, Joseph and Mary flee political violence to Egypt in order to seek safe harbor, and how frightening that had to be for them, and what a jaunt it was for them to make their way from Bethlehem all the way into Egypt. And so, as I was listening to those stories, it just reminded me about how our faith is connected in this idea of refugee, of migrants, and the importance for us to provide sanctuary in all the facets that you talk about in the podcast. It was really, really well done and really a great reminder.
So you mentioned migrants, and again, Jesus, Joseph, and Mary's experience.
Yeah.
But let's talk about migrants today. They're fleeing political unrest, violence in their home countries. Talk to us a little bit about why people would choose to travel roads such as the Devil's Highway. What is that experience like? Talk about the motivator to take on such a dangerous trek.
I'll speak a little bit to it for now. For one, I think there's a misunderstanding that people necessarily want to come to the U.S., right? As though the U.S. is sort of this friendly place, this kind of Pollyannish idea that we're all just holding hands, welcoming everyone. That's not true, right? Migrants who come are often coming, in large part because of what we might call coerced or semi-coerced push factors, violence, political unrest. And one clear thing, right? In the 1980s, it is civil war in Guatemala and El Salvador. There's a clear push factor, and we have for that the application of the Refugee Act of 1980, based on the well-founded fear of persecution. It applies very clearly. Now, you can't necessarily, the same sort of 1980 Refugee Act can't be applied when there's violence. It's not state-sanctioned violence, but it might be, even in my own family, having, encountered cartel violence. That stuff doesn't map on, and it's not as legible either. So it's been the case among migrants that a culture of suspicion has long pervaded their stories. And we often hear these horror stories. One of the reasons that migrants do attest, in such grisly detail to what's happened is because of this culture of disbelief or suspicion. And unless they're giving really kind of minute details, well, the violence affects everyone, why not just go to Mexico instead? But the case is pretty clear that there seems to be really no place that is offering refuge, respite, and it's been consistent that houses of worship, faith communities, have been a place that people can turn to. Not everyone is turning to houses of worship, but yeah, the push factors are really hard to explain. There's economics, right? Do you just blame a country in isolation for policies? No, obviously, right? It's lopsided trade that's been around for more than a decade. We're talking about centuries at this point. Destabilization of governments that we saw in the 1980s in Central America, but we've seen recently even in Haiti. Again, lots of factors, and not all of it is necessarily covered by asylum and refugee laws, and that's what makes it very difficult. And migrants enter, therefore, a very precarious condition here in the U.S. in that nobody would want to take that up. Again,
Right.
it's really, really difficult.
Yeah. So, Lloyd, I'm so glad you brought that up because Good Faith Media went down to the border a few years ago and interviewed migrants and refugees, both on the U.S. side and the Mexican side of the border. Many of those refugees were coming up from Central America, making that long journey towards the border. And I can't tell you, every person that we spoke to talked about fleeing either political violence or economic downturns, just attempting to feed their family, just with the very hope of maybe providing some kind of morsel of nourishment and shelter for their family. And I was really struck by the desperateness of these refugees to, one, first of all, to make that trek across, a vast expanse of land, risking their lives, a lot of times having to make deals with the coyotes and the cartels down there just to make it to the border. And to think that they're just making this decision flippantly to come here for prosperity is absolutely ridiculous. They're putting their lives on the line just to survive and the opportunity to survive in this country. And then when they get to the border, they are met unfortunately, with some compassion fortunately with some compassion and hospitality by some local communities down there and churches down there. But politically, they're being rejected. And that is what is so disheartening. So, Sergio, talk a little bit about that journey. You all spell that out, I think, in the second episode about what it was like for, one family to make that journey and how difficult it was along the Devil's Highway.
Yeah, I think in the 1980s, to pull this back to the origins of the sanctuary movement, you have people who are fleeing death squads, right? I mean, this is like people arriving at their door, state-sanctioned violence, and oftentimes those state-sanctioned violence that was being funded by the United States, right? This is one of the things that motivated American church people to get involved, is when they realized that their own government, their own taxpayer dollars, were helping kind of create the circumstances that were forcing people to flee northward. But if we think about these people and living in a place like Guatemala, right, it's a country that's already in many ways impoverished and people are struggling to get by. And then you add this second layer, of course, of the government sanctioning extra legal violence that is leading to death in the highlands and leading just absolute devastation. And people are left without any option. I'm reminded here of the Somali British poet Winston Shire, who once said that no one leaves home unless home is the mouth of a shark. Right. I mean, circumstances need to be so stark that you would decide to uplift yourself, to leave this place that you have known, your family has known for centuries, perhaps, right? This is your homeland, and you would decide to leave it completely and take your family with you. And the voyage to arrive to the United States, of course, required people to migrate throughout Mexico, a place that also in the 1980s to the present were not always the safest conditions, and a country that did not offer them much solace, much less safe harbor in terms of finding better living opportunities, working opportunities, or just a sense of security. And so it is the United States that is supposed to offer some sort of relief. And sometimes I think it's hard for Americans to understand this because we abstract the idea of the migrant, right? We think of them as kind of this individual who is not a human being. But whenever I talk about this with church communities or to my students, I have to remind them, and it seems so kind of elementary, right? But to remind people that we're talking about human beings, families, individuals who are trying to provide for themselves, for their children, and to ask people, what would you do in this situation?
Exactly.
If you felt like you had no other option? Would you not do anything that you could to protect yourself and protect your family, to find a better life, even if it required you to travel thousands of miles, and even if it meant perhaps that you would break the law? But if at the end of the day, you were providing a sense of hope and safety and security, wouldn't you do this as well?
100%. So another aspect of this conversation, Lloyd, that I really appreciate you all adding within the podcast itself was the sanctuary movement's connection to liberation theology. So Lloyd, can you talk about that, or Sergio want to follow up on that? Because I thought that was really fascinating.
It's one of the core ideas that we talk about in the podcast, and it's what's motivating many clergy in Central America to advocate for the poor. So you have the core tenet, right, in liberation theology that there's a preferential option for the poor, or that if Jesus were alive today, that he would side with the poor. Now, the problem with saying that in 1960s, 70s, 80s Americas is that gets painted red as Marxist rhetoric, as communist rhetoric, right? Yeah. So there's a whole red baiting that happens. It's the case with the Salvadoran Archbishop Oscar Romero, who was assassinated while offering mass in a hospital March 24th, 1980, that, he was seen as a threat to the state. He is the Archbishop, right? He's offering mass. But the fact that he carried on what was perceived to be a revolutionary sort of, communist message, that's enough to incite fear. So there's other sorts of, mandates within liberation theology. One of them is this idea of sort of consciousness raising, right? So one of them is that's enacted through literacy campaigns. And so I've read the records myself of refugees who leave Guatemala and El Salvador in the 80s. And the reason that they were that threats were made to their lives is because they were running literacy campaigns among the farm workers, among the campesinos. And that is seen as a threat to the state because, well, if you do that, there's a chance that they're going to, engage in collective action. And God forbid they should form unions. That's all just completely red baited through and through. And so, yeah, you have liberation theology that, in the U.S., it arrives somewhat in a different form, but you have a much more agreeable soil that it lands in which you have mainline Protestant churches, even Catholic churches that do mobilize along the lines of Jesus would be on the side of the poor. Right. Who are the poor among us? Who are the most oppressed? It is these people who should, by every facet of the 1980 Refugee Act, be classified as refugees. But the Reagan administration is saying that they're economic migrants. Yeah. You can flip that on its head too, right? If they're economic migrants, then they're probably poor. So liberation theology opens a space to say, well, Jesus would have sided them with them anyway. But that's the canard that just tossed around in the 80s. They're all economic migrants. They want to come here to partake in the American dream. Go for it, Sergio.
I think the thing that I would add to this, and the last piece of liberation theology that is really important for the sanctuary movement, is the idea of praxis, right? The idea that liberation theology calls us to live out our faith in action, right? There's this mandate within liberation theology. We see, we judge, and then we have to act. And people of faith in the United States in the 1980s recognized that call as an obligation to understand their faith as something that has to be lived, not something we just preach about, not something we talk about on Sundays at Mass or in service, but something that we go out and do in our daily lives. And so when you are confronted with the question of what are we to do when a person is being denied political asylum in this country, you have a decision to make. And it's a very stark decision, right? Are you going to side with the poor, the dispossessed, the marginalized, or with the state, even if the state is wrong in this instance? And so the sanctuary movement, as we kind of profile in this podcast, is really also a way of living out a challenge to the state when you know that your moral and scriptural teaching tells you to do something different.
Wow. Well said. And as Lloyd and Sergio were talking, I just was reminded that, a lot of times we talk about Jesus identifying with the poor and the refugee. Well, the reality is he identifies with them so clearly is because he is one of them. He is a poor refugee. And we see this time and time again. And it's like the church today has just forgotten that or ignored it or tried to, reimagine Jesus into this, white dude, as our colleague Brad Onishi said, straight American white Jesus. But the reality is Jesus was, a person of color. He was a Palestinian Jew who was a refugee and someone who grew up in poverty. So we forget that. And so thank you so much for reminding us.
Well, Sergio, let's move on and talk a minute about the elephant in the room.
Oh, let's not. But I did see what you did there. The elephant
Did
in the
you
room.
see what I did there? Actually, I have a different word written down, but you told me I couldn't say that. So we'll just let them imagine.
The big orange elephant in the room. Go ahead.
Sure. So after the election last week, your podcast is really even more critical. Trump has campaigned on an anti-immigration message, mainly targeting Latinos. So why do you think this is so effective with the majority of Americans?
Oh my goodness. Well,
I know.
this is
Yeah.
like
Can you give me
a semester-long question?
Right.
What is effective about this? I think there's any number of ways we can approach this. I think that Anti-immigrant sentiment, xenophobia, nativism has always been a powerful strain of the American political imagination, right? This is obviously not the first time that a political leader has been able to pull on these ideas. And even for Trump, of course, it's not the first time that he's been able to. He's kind of playing the same old instruments that he played in 2016, but we have always kind of had this tension in the United States, right? This ideal of wanting to be a welcoming nation, right? A nation of immigrants that can serve as that beacon of hope. And in many ways, it has been, right? It has served as a place of safe harbor and refuge for millions, hundreds of millions of people from all across the world who have found a better life here in the United States. But there's always that tension about who is being invited into the country and under what circumstances. And so I think it's fair to say that our country has always been a welcoming space for immigrants and specifically for laborers. But the question, of course, is under what circumstances they are allowed to live here. Are they allowed to be full members of our communities, or do we only want them to be here to pick our fruit and to care for our children, right? Or are they actually going to be invited to be citizens? Are they going to be invited to be members of our churches? Will they have a political voice in this country as well? And so what we're seeing today is just a 200-year process in continuation. It's Americans having to grapple with the fact that we've always had a population of this country that has lived at the margins, right? The 10 to 11 million undocumented residents who have called the United States home for decades now have been forced to live in the shadows for quite some time. I think we're going to see moving forward after last week's election is Americans are going to have to grapple with what the material circumstances of this call for the largest deportation force in the nation's history is actually going to look like, right? Do Americans actually want this? Was it actually rhetoric, or is this going to mean the separation of communities, right? And in very stark, visible ways and physical ways that we're going to see play out in the news? Or are people going to find a way to push back against this? And I think what Lloyd and I have tried to do in this podcast is to offer an alternative, right? To show how in the past, our country has had to grapple with these questions. And there are pockets of people of faith, who have posited an alternative, who have offered a different vision for what this country should actually look like.
I love that. And I appreciate you bringing up the mass deportations, because that was another, element of his rhetoric during the campaign, was this promise of mass deportations beginning on day one. And so, Lloyd, what I have come to surmise in Trump's rhetoric is to actually believe what he says. Now, does it come to fruition? Who knows, depending on how much resistance and how much sense that the guardrails around him have or can contribute to this conversation. But at the same time, there is going to be an attempt for mass deportation. I believe that with every fiber of my being. So I remember in 2016 and the years following going to major cities and sitting down with pastors and communities who had created sanctuary for migrants and refugees in their church space. Are you already starting to hear that occurring? Is the infrastructure already there and in place? Because, we had to have some idea that there was going to be a possible election, a second Trump administration. So do you hear that? Do you see that? Is there a network there that already exists to kind of revamp up this sanctuary movement?
So, Mitch, I mean, your reading of this is spot on. The mass deportations, Trump has said that virtually every rally in the past couple of months, right? And when he says that, he pairs it with this rhetoric that is anti-sanctuary. He tries to smear the concept of sanctuary. He said at his rally in Coachella just a couple of weeks ago, you know what a sanctuary state is? That's a place where you keep criminals, right? Who the hell wants that? The mass migration invasion has crushed wages, crashed school systems. Your systems are a disaster, speaking to residents in California. And what he's able to do quite well is stoke fear, right? It's an invasion. It's what the anthropologist Leo Chavez has called this Latino threat narrative. So we think about the border crisis. It's centered on the U.S.-Mexico border. There's worries, right? I mean, you've seen the images. I'm not from actually being down in the border, but the images of the border, right?
Right.
It's a long line of people. It's what he calls an infinity line. So many people that you can't even see the end of it. In many of the photographs, they're crossing in desperate conditions. They're coming at you in the photographs you see online in journals. There's a sense of alarm and chaos.
Right.
Now, Yes, I think Trump's rhetoric is not to be taken as a bluff. In
Right.
communities of faith, sanctuary organizers are not going to take it as a bluff.
Hmm.
The main reason is his first week in office, is one of his first priorities in his first week. Yeah, he signed a couple of executive orders, one of them 13768, in which he sought to defund sanctuary cities. So at these rallies, again, when he's speaking about the harm that migration does, illegal crime, as he called it, or, he said in an RNC speech that hundreds of thousands of migrants are killing Americans. Like that's just in no way fractionally statistically true,
Hmm.
right? But he stoked up this fear quite well. And the misinformation aside, even for the people who can discern it and not discern it, I think it's not to be taken as a bluff. So yeah, the first week tries to defund sanctuary cities. The ultimate goal is to dismantle sanctuary cities. And Sergio and I are currently working on an article right now that explains this a bit more. But sanctuary cities do throw a wrench in mass deportation plans in the sense there's a non-cooperation agreement between local authorities and the federal enforcement agencies on immigration. And so I think you will see a revival of sorts of these sanctuary cities. What we will see from faith leaders, I think that's to be determined, but we can, I think, as we've seen in the past, bank on some form of sacred resistance.
Hmm. I love that term, sacred resistance. I love that. Well, Lloyd, Sergio, thank you so much for visiting with us at Good Faith Weekly. The podcast is Sanctuary on the Border Between Church and State. It is fabulous. You can subscribe to it wherever you listen to your podcast, and we encourage you to do so. Don't stop. Don't pass go. Go to subscribe to Sanctuary right now because it is very well done. And more so, I can't tell you how thankful we are for all of the great people of faith across the country who are standing up and providing sanctuary for these incredible people who have made a journey and who are just seeking freedom and a place to call home and provide for their families. Thank you so much for bringing this to our attention. But before we let you go, Lloyd and Sergio, we've got one last question to ask each of you, and Missy gets the honor of asking it.
Well, Lloyd and Sergio, as you know, our tagline at Good Faith Media is "There's more to tell." So in light of your work and our conversation today, what is your more to tell? And I always go in alphabetical order. So Lloyd, we'll start with you.
Well, I let the cat out of the bag a little bit, but yeah, Sergio and I are working on a volume called Sacred Refuge, New Histories of the Sanctuary Movement. We hope that will be out next year.
Good.
And it's taking leading historians on the sanctuary movement, the 80s, the modern iteration of sanctuary, and trying to provide, histories about new sites, sort of new concepts of sanctuary. One chapter really foregrounds the role of liberation theology. Folks who have been studying this for a long time. And we're really excited to provide new insights on the longer history of the sanctuary movement.
Good. Well, let us know when it drops, and we'll make certain to publicize it.
All right, Sergio, how about you? What's your more to tell?
I'm going to build off my good friend Lloyd's idea here, which is I want to serve as more of a call to action, a reminder here. And this is why Lloyd and I do the work that we do, which is in these perhaps times of desperation after last week's election, I'm sure a lot of people feel a little bit despondent. But the reason that Lloyd and I are so enthralled with the history of sanctuary and think it's so important is because people have been in these places before, right? In these moments when they feel like there's nothing they can do. But the reality is that there are tools all around them to find different ways to push back, to offer an alternative vision. So for listeners who are thinking about what does this have to do with me? Well, all of us have a different role to play. And as a historian and as a teacher, my first instinct is to help people to read, and to learn more about these histories and these pasts, because there is so much that we can draw from different ways in which people of faith have found ways to pool their energies together, to draw from their scriptural teachings, to offer that alternative vision for what our communities can actually look like as places of belonging for everyone who wants to call them home.
I love that. Well, Lloyd Barba, Sergio González, again, congratulations on the podcast, Sanctuary on the Border Between Church and State. It is fabulous. You are welcome back anytime, my friends.
Thank you so much.
Thanks for having us.
This interview could not be more timely. After the election of last week, and now to discover that these anti-immigration policies, or anti-immigrant policies, I should say, more precisely, are going to be implemented starting day one in the new Trump administration. This idea of sanctuary needs to ramp up and ramp up quickly.
It's almost like the Holy Spirit just knew we needed to have this interview this week, right?
Exactly, yeah.
So before we get into the kind of the theological kind of examination of this interview, I want to admit, embarrassingly enough, I didn't fully understand the concept of sanctuary city and sanctuary before this. So maybe like take a minute and talk about what just definition.
So its roots are in the Bible and in the historical Christian church. When individuals would be fleeing local authorities, they would find themselves in churches and claim sanctuary, seeking refuge as well as the necessities to keep them alive, while all the time warding off the authorities who were looking for them. It did not mean that they were guiltless, and I want to say that. What it does mean is that there was an attitude by the church to welcome the stranger, regardless of who they are. And so that was the attitude back historically. Now, the modern day sanctuary movement that Lloyd and Sergio were talking about, love the history in their podcast, download it, learn about it, it's great. But like in the first Trump administration, there were cities who claimed to be sanctuary cities. That simply meant that local authorities were not going to be the long arm of the federal government, especially to implement immigration policy. What that meant was that local police officers, local sheriff's departments were going to continue to work within the community, but they were not going to turn over undocumented immigrants in their community because they wanted to keep them safe from crime, from local crime.
They were going to protect and serve.
Exactly.
Okay. So if you're, someone who's here undocumented, you could call if you had a problem and know that there would be a response.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay. So, I mean, it's to create a community that is a safe harbor for people to live, that they can feel safe in, no matter of their immigration status, because it is not local law enforcement's responsibility to turn people over if they are found to be undocumented. Their responsibility is to care for them and to serve them and protect them from local crime. And so that's what these sanctuary cities do. And so that's all up and down local government when a city claims itself to be a sanctuary city. So that is an important element. And with these draconian laws and policies that we are expecting.
Okay, so now let's talk about, what is coming or what has been promised around the bend come January.
Yeah. Well, President-elect Trump has already indicated through his rhetoric on the campaign trail that beginning day one, there was going to be mass deportations. And the one thing that I have concluded after his first term in office is that I take him for his word.
He's not kidding.
He's
right?
not kidding.
Okay.
And so what that means is that there is going to be this incredible effort to hunt down and find undocumented individuals in this country and ship them back to their place of origin. And we've already got hints that this is going to happen because he's pinpointed Tom Homan to be his immigration czar, who oversaw the separation of family policy in the first administration. Stephen Miller is going to be his deputy chief of staff, who is extremely anti-immigrant. And I will even declare, I think he's a white supremacist. He uses that kind of language. And so these are the people who are going to be in charge of this. And so this is coming. And so I hope that the sanctuary movement continues to ramp up and prepare for what is about to occur in January 2025, because I am really fearful for a lot of people out there, both non-citizens and citizens, who are going to be caught up in this wholesale deportation of immigrants.
So let's talk to the evangelicals for a moment.
Okay.
who really have gotten behind this political ideology.
Two things I want to say about that. One, these policies are as un-American as you can imagine. Now, why would I say that? Because, Missy, if you are not an indigenous person in this country, You are the sons and daughters of immigrants. Mm-hmm. The only reason the United States of America exists at all is because of refugees and asylum seekers seeking a better place for their family and fleeing religious and political persecution in their homeland. That is the foundation of this country that we have totally abandoned. Mm-hmm. This is why we exist. This is why when you go to New York City Harbor and you look out the Statue of Liberty, you're reminded mm-hmm. about why this country is so important to the rest of the world, because we accept the masses. We accept those who are being persecuted and are seeking a better life. And so to pass these type of draconian, anti-immigrant, anti-refugee, anti-asylum seeker policies is one of the most un-American things I could ever imagine.
So now let's talk to the Christians, to the Jesus followers.
All right, I'm going to try not to cuss. I know that's your lane. So
that's my lane. Thank you.
That's right. So as far as theology is concerned and people of faith, not only is this un-American, it is also very anti-Christian. And what I mean by that is that we have either totally forgotten or have totally ignored the reality of who Jesus was and is. At an early age, 2 years old, Jesus becomes a refugee and asylum seeker. Why? Because Mary and Joseph were fleeing political violence. Herod had passed a law to kill all 2-year-olds, and Jesus was a 2-year-old. And so they flee Palestine for Egypt and find safe harbor from the Pharaoh. Why do you think Jesus said time and time again that we are called to welcome the stranger, to love our neighbor? Because Jesus was a benefactor of a foreign government welcoming him as a political refugee.
He was the stranger.
He was the stranger.
I think we all need to understand who we are in the story.
Exactly.
We all want to be the Good Samaritan.
We do.
But at the end of the day, we're not doing it, you guys.
We are not doing it. And so that is what is so infuriating to me. It really makes me want to cuss, is that we have either forgotten that as a people of faith, as Jesus followers, or we have decided just to totally ignore it and to move on to something else.
Because I feel like we don't need Jesus anymore.
And unfortunately, I think you're right. Those people who are anti-immigrant feel like they don't need Jesus, because the reality is, Missy, they don't need Jesus because they have Trump. That has supplanted Jesus for them. And that is heartbreaking.
I feel like Trump rode that wave as long as he needed to.
Yeah.
And now we're at a turning point.
We are at a turning point. And so I am extremely thankful for scholars like Lloyd and Sergio. I am even more thankful for those folks on the ground who are providing sanctuary to these refugees and asylum seekers in their communities. We're going to need more of you, to be quite frank about this, because it is going to get bad.
I just don't think you have to go very far before you know somebody who knows, before it becomes personal to you. I remember even from the first administration, our son was playing competitive soccer and having a teammate whose parent was not able to travel out of state with us, mm-hmm. or who had to ride with somebody because that parent was undocumented, had been here for years upon years, mm-hmm. but was not documented and was fearful of traveling over state lines or driving very far. So it doesn't go very far before you become personally affected and realize, oh, this was my friend.
Yep.
I had no idea.
Yeah.
And I feel like that's the point that we're all about to get to.
Yeah.
You know somebody, or you have somebody in your life that this is going to impact, that you're like, oh, I didn't know you meant them. I thought you just meant the other.
Yeah.
Let me just break it to you. The other is your friend. The other is your neighbor. The other is your family. You just might not know it yet.
You're exactly right. So, like I said earlier, I am so thankful that there are scholars out there like Lloyd Barba and Sergio González and their podcast, Sanctuary on the Border Between Church and State. But I'm more thankful for those people in those communities who are providing sanctuary for these refugees and these people who are really scared right now. And they are our friends. They are our neighbors who Jesus told us to love and to welcome. And so as a person of faith, as a Jesus follower myself, I am going to do that. And I hope that there are others who rise up and do it as well. It's extremely important that you keep your eyes open and that you make certain that you extend love and grace to those around you, because you never know who you're going to be talking to. So I want to thank Lloyd and Sergio for coming on the podcast this week. Gave us a lot to think about. And again, I just cannot recommend enough their podcast, Sanctuary on the Border Between Church and State. Well, Missy, you and I will be back next week with another guest. Until then, we want to encourage all of our listeners to either get bangs or to
get the bangs.
Get the bangs, or to get a board and start sanding.
That's right.
But
we all got to cope how we have to.
That's right. In addition to those two, keep living good faith. You've been listening to Good Faith Weekly, hosted by Mitch and Missy Randall. This weekly podcast from Good Faith Media discusses matters of faith and culture.
Subscribe wherever you get your podcast and give us a like and a glowing review. We produce the podcast out of Norman, Oklahoma. Our music comes from Pond 5.
And we're supported by listeners like you. Learn more about us at goodfaithmedia.org.